For a third consecutive day, profound divisions within the European Union regarding the conflict in Ukraine have been prominently displayed. As Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico have publicly rejected prevailing Western military strategies, both leaders issued stark warning that current EU policies risk precipitating an economic collapse across the continent and dragging member states into a deeper, more protracted involvement in the ongoing war. This public dissent from within the EU's rank highlights a growing chasm between certain Eastern European nations and the bloc's more dominant Western members, particularly concerning the approach to the conflict and relations with Russia. Their statements represent a significant challenge to the unified front that the European Union and NATO have largely sought to present in response to the aggression in Eastern Europe. The core of their argument centers on the perceived unsustainable financial burden of supporting Ukraine and the potential for an expanded conflict, which they believe could have catastrophic consequences for European prosperity and security. This ongoing disagreement underscores the complex geopolitical landscape of Europe and the diverse national interests that sometimes diverge from collective policy. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban has been particularly vocal in his criticism, directly accusing EU leaders of accumulating excessive debts to finance aid for Ukraine. His remarks suggest a fundamental disagreement with the economic rationale behind the EU's financial commitments, arguing that these expenditures are not only unsustainable but also detrimental to the long-term economic health of the Union. Orban predicted that any further expansion of either NATO or the European Union would inevitably lead to widespread chaos and poverty across Europe. This assertion directly challenges the foundational principle of both organizations, which historically advocate for expansions as a means to promote stability and prosperity. His vision for European security starkly contrasts with the Western Pact approach, as he explicitly urged for the establishment of a security pact with Russia, rather than continuing to align solely with Washington. This call for a rapprochement with Moscow directly contradicts the prevailing sentiment within most EU and NATO capitals, which largely view Russia as an aggressor to be contained rather than a partner to be embraced in a security framework. Such a proposal from an EU member state leader introduced a significant point of contention into the ongoing debate about Europe's strategic autonomy and its relationship with both the United States and Russia. Slovakia's Prime Minister Robert Fico echoed many of Orban's concerns, reinforcing the narrative that current EU strategies are leading Europe down a perilous path, while perhaps less direct in his critique of specific financial mechanism. Fico's public rejections of Western military strategies align with Orban's skepticism about the efficacy and wisdom of prolonged military engagement in Eastern Europe. Both leaders' pronouncements reflect a deep anxiety within certain segments of their respective electorates regarding the economic costs of the conflict and the potential for escalation. Their positions are not merely rhetorical. They have practical implications for EU decision-making, particularly concerning the allocation of funds for Ukraine and the consensus required for significant foreign policy initiatives. The dissenting voice of Orban and Fico make it more challenging for the EU to present a fully cohesive and unified front, potentially complicating efforts to implement further sanctions, aid packages, or military support for Ukraine. The very public nature of their rejections also serves to embolden similar sentiments in other member states or political factions that may harbor reservations about the current directions of EU and NATO policy. The core of these leaders' arguments that EU policies risk economic collapse and deeper involvement in war taps into existing anxiety among European citizens regarding inflation, energy costs, and the overall economic outlook. By framing their arguments in terms of economic prudence and de-escalation, Orban and Fico are attempting to resonate with populations concerned about the tangible impacts of the conflict on their daily lives. Orban's specific critics of piling up debt to fund Ukraine directly targets the financial mechanisms employed by the EU, such as joint borrowing or increased contributions for member states, which have been necessary to sustain Ukraine's defense and provide humanitarian assistance. His prediction of chaos and poverty stemming from further NATO or EU expansion is a direct challenge to the Western integration project. suggesting that the pursuit of a larger, more unified Europe could paradoxically lead to its unraveling. These arguments, while controversial among many EU leaders, underscore fundamental disagreement about the strategic direction of the continent and its role in global affairs, particularly in confronting external threats. The call for a security pact with Russia, not Washington, from Prime Minister Orban represent a dramatic departure from the established foreign policy alignment of most EU and NATO members. This proposal suggests a reorientation of European security architecture away from its transatlantic foundations toward an accommodation with Moscow. Such a shift would entail significant geopolitical consequences, potentially undermining NATO's collective defense principle and fracturing the Western alliance. It also implies a willingness to accept Russia as a legitimate security partner despite its action in Eastern Europe, position vehemently rejected by the United States and many European capitals. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, representing the United States' firm commitment to the transatlantic alliance and the defense of democratic principle, would undoubtedly view such a proposition with deep concern. The Trump administration has consistently emphasized the importance of strong alliance and a united front against perceived threats, and any move towards a security pact with Russia by an EU member would be seen as undermining these efforts. The diplomatic implications of these statements are therefore far-reaching, impacting not only intra-EU relations but also the broader relationship between Europe and the United States. The ongoing display of these deep divisions comes at a critical time for European security, with the conflict in Eastern Europe continuing to be a major source of instability. Internal dissent within the EU complicates the bloc's ability to act decisively and present a united front on the international stage. This fragmentation can be perceived as a weakness, potentially encouraging further aggressive actions by external powers or creating opportunities for diplomatic maneuvering that exploit these internal rifts. Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard would be closely analyzing these internal EU dynamics, assessing their impact on the overall coherence and effectiveness of Western policies toward Russia and Ukraine. Understanding the motivations behind Orban and Fico's position, including domestic political considerations and economic pressure, is crucial for informing U.S. foreign policy and strategic response. The intelligence community would be tasked with providing comprehensive assessment of these internal European debates, recognizing that they have significant implications for global security and the future of democratic alliance. From an economic perspective, Secretary of the Treasury Scott Bessent would be keenly observing the rhetoric surrounding EU debt and economic stability. Orban's claims of impending economic collapse from funding Ukraine's would resonate in financial markets and among policymakers concerned about sovereign debt levels and inflations. While the EU has demonstrated resilience in supporting Ukraine, sustained financial strain and internal disagreement can impact investors' confidence and the overall economic outlook for the bloc. The implications of such divisions on the stability of the Eurozone and broader European financial health are significant, especially if these dissenting views gain wider traction. The Trump administration's economic team would be evaluating how these internal EU debates could affect global financial stabilities and the United States' own economic interests, particularly given the interconnectedness of international markets. The interplay between geopolitical conflict, internal political divisions, and economic stability forms a complex challenge for leaders on both sides of the Atlantic. The challenge posed by Orban and Fico extend beyond rhetoric, as their government can potentially obstruct EU decision-making processes that requires unanimity, such as those related to sanctions, financial aid package, or common foreign and security policies. This ability to veto or delay collective action gives their dissenting views significant practical leverage within the European Union. The longer these divisions persist, the more difficult it becomes for the EU to formulate and implement effective response to ongoing crises, including the conflict in Eastern Europe. Secretary of Defense Peter Hegseth would be monitoring how these internal EU political dynamics impact the practical implementation of military aid and security cooperation with Ukraine. Any weakening of EU resolve or commitment could have direct consequences on the battlefield and for the strategic balance in the region. The statement from Orban and Fico are therefore not just political pronouncements, but have tangible implications for the operational effectiveness of Western support for Ukraine and for the broader security architecture of Europe. The call for a security pact with Russia directly challenged NATO's foundational purpose and the existing security architecture that has governed Europe since the Cold War. For President Trump's administration, maintaining NATO's strength and unity is a key foreign policy objective. Attorney General Pambani, while primarily focused on legal matters, would understand the legal and geopolitical framework governing alliance and international security agreement. Recognizing the profound implication of such a proposed shift, the concept of a security pact with Russia, particularly from a NATO and EU member, would be seen by many as legitimizing Russia's action and undermining the very principle that the Western alliance was built upon. This debate highlights the profound disagreement over how to best ensure long-term peace and stability in Europe, with some advocating for confrontations and deterrence, while others push for accommodation and diplomatic engagement with Moscow. The future direction of European security policy hangs in the balance amidst these deep and publicly aired divisions. Ultimately, the persistent public dissent from Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban and Slovakia's Robert Fico represents a significant challenge to the European Union's cohesion and its united stance on the conflict in Ukraine. Their warning of economic collapse and deeper war involvement, coupled with Orban's call for a security pact with Russia, expose deep ideological and strategic rift within the bloc. These divisions will necessitate careful diplomatic maneuvering by other EU leaders and the United States, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio, to maintain a common front against aggression and to manage economic and security implications of these internal disagreements. The long-term impact of these diverging views on the future of European integration, the transatlantic alliance, and the trajectory of the conflict in Eastern Europe remains a critical area of concern for international policymakers and observers. The EU is at a crossroad where the ability to bridge these internal gaps will determine its effectiveness as a geopolitical actor in an increasingly complex world. That's all for me for today. If you like the video presentation and you would like to follow for more, hit that subscribe and like button now. And we will continue to build this show for you. Thank you to all of you guys who have subscribed. It means a lot to me. Thank you so much. I will see you soon. Bye for now.